Before the movies, before the myth, there were real men who ruled America's underworld with fear and cunning. But who was the true Godfather, the most powerful mob boss of all time? We see these guys on screen, but the reality is far more brutal and fascinating. These weren't actors, they were men who built empires on violence and loyalty. Imagine holding the fate of cities in your hands, making or breaking lives with a nod. They created their own rules, controlled unions, politicians, entire industries. The American Mafia was the dark side of the American dream. Today we're pulling back the curtain, looking past Hollywood to the real men behind the myth. We'll break down who they were, how they got their power, and what made them so feared. Let's dive in and find out who truly deserves the title of the real Godfather. How did the American Mafia begin? It started with Sicilian gangs in the late 1800s, immigrants bringing old-world ways to a new land. They formed tight-knit families for protection and opportunity, creating their own justice when the system failed them. Prohibition changed everything, turning street gangs into a billion-dollar criminal empire overnight. Arnold Rothstein saw the potential organized crime like a business, with supply chains, distribution, and muscle. The mob bought cops, judges, politicians, and infiltrated unions, controlling the lifeblood of cities. Legendary names rose: Capone, Luciano, Genovese, Gambino, Gotti. These men weren't just criminals, they were CEOs of a violent corporation. The golden age of the Mafia, from the 1920s to the 1980s, saw them as a shadow government, influencing everything from elections to movies. The FBI struggled to keep up with their discipline and secrecy. The Commission and the Five Families created a system to minimize conflict and maximize profit. At the top of each pyramid was the boss, the man whose word was law. Out of all these kings, who had the biggest kingdom? Who was the true emperor? That's the question we're here to answer. When you think mob boss, Al Capone is the first name that comes to mind. He was a rock star, front-page news, flashy suits, and total control of Chicago in the 1920s. His empire pulled in the equivalent of over $1 billion a year. Capone ran bootlegging, gambling, brothels, and commanded an army of gunmen. The St. Valentine's Day Massacre? That was his message to the world. Don't mess with Capone. He played the public as a Robin Hood, but his fame made him a target. The feds couldn't get him for murder, so they nailed him on tax evasion. Capone's power was massive but limited. He ruled Chicago, not the nation. He didn't build the system, he just perfected his corner of it. True power is often quiet. Capone was anything but. His reign was bright and violent, but burned out fast. Less than a decade before Alcatraz. He set the template for the gangster boss, but others learned from his mistakes. Real, lasting power doesn't crave the spotlight, it avoids it. Capone showed what was possible, but others would take it further. He was the poster boy, not the puppet master. The real Godfather would be something else entirely. If Capone was the celebrity, Lucky Luciano was the architect. Luciano saw the old-school bosses as outdated and ended their reign with a mob-style corporate takeover. Instead of declaring himself boss of all bosses, he created the Commission, a governing body for the mob. This stopped endless wars and let everyone focus on making money. Luciano turned street gangs into a national syndicate, integrating the mob and boosting profits. He controlled the New York docks, gambling, loan sharking, and pioneered the narcotics trade. His influence stretched across the country, pulling strings quietly and efficiently. Even after being imprisoned, Luciano's power endured. He helped the U.S. Navy secure the docks during World War II in exchange for a commuted sentence. Deported to Italy, he still shaped the global heroin trade and remained a respected figure until his death. Luciano's genius was in building a system that outlived him. He was the puppet master, not the showman. His power transcended borders and prison walls. He didn't just play the game, he changed it. But even he couldn't escape the consequences forever. The mob's true power would evolve again. Carlo Gambino was the opposite of Capone, quiet, unassuming, and deadly effective. He He took over the Gambino family in 1957, orchestrating his boss's assassination with surgical precision. Gambino ruled for nearly 2 decades, expanding into legitimate businesses and making the family a financial powerhouse. He controlled unions and entire sectors of New York's economy, always staying in the shadows. His strength was intelligence and patience. He solved problems with words, not bullets. The FBI watched him for years and got nothing. He was disciplined, never careless. Gambino's conversations happened on quiet walks, never on the phone. Unlike Capone or Gotti, he avoided the spotlight and outlasted his rivals. He died a free, wealthy man in his own bed, something no other boss of his stature achieved. Gambino beat the system and won the game. He was the ultimate gray man, the king who ruled from the shadows. His legacy was quiet power, lasting deep and nearly invisible. In the world of the mob, that's the ultimate victory. He didn't just survive, he thrived. Gambino's story is the blueprint for real power. The quiet king outlasted them all. Vito Genovese was ambition personified, violent, greedy, and relentless. He rose through the ranks with Luciano but lacked his finesse, believing power came from the gun. After fleeing to Italy and returning post-war, he plotted to take over the family, forcing Frank Costello out. Genovese conspired with Gambino to eliminate rivals, aiming to become boss of all bosses. He called the infamous Appalachian meeting, hoping to cement his power, but it backfired spectacularly. The raid exposed the mob to the world and put a target on Genovese's back. His ego made him enemies among the other bosses. Soon after, he was framed in a narcotics case, allegedly by his own peers. Genovese died in prison, his power broken, a victim of his own ambition. He wanted to rule it all, but flew too close to the sun. In the end, his ruthlessness destroyed him. Genovese's story is a warning. In the mob, unchecked ambition is fatal. He was feared, but never truly respected. The real Godfather needed more than just muscle. John Gotti was the 1980s media age gangster, flashy, bold, and addicted to the spotlight. He took over the Gambino family by publicly assassinating his boss, breaking every mob rule. Gotti became a celebrity, beating 3 major cases and earning the nickname Teflon Don. Crowds cheered him, but his fame brought heat. The FBI bugged him constantly, and his own underboss, Sammy the Bull, flipped to testify. Gotti's arrogance and love of attention were his undoing. In 1992, he was convicted and sentenced to life in prison. He went from designer suits to solitary confinement, dying of cancer behind bars. Gotti's story is a cautionary tale. In the underworld, fame is a death sentence. He was powerful, but his ego destroyed him. The old-school bosses knew, real power stays hidden. Gotti's reign was spectacular but short-lived. He broke the rules, and the rules broke him. The Teflon wore off, and the legend faded. In the end, the quiet kings outlasted the loud ones. Gotti proved that the spotlight is deadly. What really made a mob boss powerful? It's a mix of fear, respect, influence, and intelligence. Fear is the foundation. Enemies and allies alike had to know crossing the boss meant death. But fear alone isn't enough. Respect is earned by making money and keeping the peace. Influence is key. Having politicians, judges, and unions in your pocket turns a gang into a syndicate. Intelligence and discipline are the secret weapons. Seeing the big picture, staying quiet, and outsmarting the law. Capone and Gotti had power, but their egos made them targets. Luciano built a system where everyone profited, earning loyalty. Gambino mastered quiet control, making himself untouchable. The most effective bosses balanced violence with restraint, ambition with patience. Too much flash and you end up like Gotti, too much fear and you end up isolated like Genovese. The real Godfathers were the ones who ruled from the shadows, not the headlines. They understood that power is a delicate balance. The quiet kings lasted the longest. In the end, true power was invisible. The mob's greatest bosses were the ones you barely saw. That's what set them apart. So, who was the real Godfather, the most powerful mob boss of all time? You could argue for Luciano's vision or Capone's force, but experts agree. Carlo Gambino stands above the rest. He took over the most powerful family, expanded its reach, and sat at the head of the commission for decades. Gambino's influence ran so deep in New York's politics and economy he was nearly untouchable. The FBI tried for years and got nothing. He was a ghost. He balanced fear, respect, and intelligence perfectly. He learned from the mistakes of Capone, Genovese, and Gotti. Gambino didn't need to announce his power. Everyone already knew. He perfected the system Luciano built and ran the mafia at its peak. He died a free man, passing his empire to a successor. In a world where most bosses end up dead or in prison, Gambino found a third way. He won the game. For that, he's the real-life Godfather. The most powerful mob boss America ever saw. Quiet, cunning, and undefeated. Real power hides in the shadows. The most powerful mob boss is often the one you never hear about. For every Gambino, there were a dozen others pulling strings in secret. The story of organized crime is written in whispers and blood. From Capone to Gotti, these men shaped American crime and inspired legends. Their legacy is woven into the fabric of America. Which boss do you think was the most powerful? Let us know in the comments. For more true crime and untold history, subscribe. There are always more stories waiting in the darkness. The underworld is never done.